Thy future calls thee with a manifold sound to crescent honours, splendours, victories vast. Awaken, O slumbering mother, and be crowned, who once wert empress of the sovereign past. These are the words of none other but the Nightingale of India, Sarojini Naidu. Today, we will discuss about the women's movement and the feminists that emerged during the Indian nationalist movement. And of course, we will start with the last phase of the 19th century and go on until the middle of the 20th century. To begin with, let me talk about a few authors who have written about this. One of the well-known authors of this period are women like Tonika Sarkar, who has written a number of books and articles on this particular period. Then there is, of course, the grand dame of this period, the historian who worked and whose lecture you probably have seen in our site, that is Professor Geraldine Forbes. Professor Geraldine Forbes' book, The History of Women in Modern India, is one of the leading textbooks, and it is used in 101 women's studies courses all over the world. Other than that, there are other authors like Judith Walsh, or for that matter, we have Prof Banerjee, who has written about femininity, masculinity, children, childcare during the colonial period. Then we have Padma Anagol, who has written about the feminists in this period. So we have a number of people. With Tonika Sarkar, we also have to mention the name of Shumit Sarkar. Then there is the famous article by Parthu Chatterjee. So there are a number of people who have worked on this particular period. Our discussion will start with that of Pandita Ramabai. Pandita Ramabai was an exceptional woman of this period. Pandita Ramabai was from Maharashtra, like a lot of her predecessors, and she was the first Indian woman to be titled Pandita, or Pandita meaning a person who's highly educated. It was the feminine version of Pandit. And she was also given the title of Saraswati from Calcutta University. So Pandita Ramabai was from an upper caste Hindu family, and she wrote extensively about the high caste Hindu woman, which is also the title of her book. She talks about the high caste Hindu women and the oppression that they faced within their families. And interestingly, the perspective that she brought out was that this veil of oppression that the women were facing was actually not only accepted but welcomed by women, because these women were made to think, were made to understand that actually what was happening was that their respectability depended on this veil of oppression, like the parda, like the lack of political rights for women. So Pandita Ramabai, like some of our feminist foremothers that we discussed in our last lecture, was also a figure of the resistance, like Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain. But Ruqayya Sakhawat Sultana's Dream was written in 1905. Pandita Ramabai's high caste Hindu women actually came way before that. It was in the 1880s. So Pandita Ramabai was almost like a predecessor of a number of these feminist foremothers who we have discussed in our last lecture. Now, the interesting thing about this particular phase is that this was a time when feminist consciousness, particularly political consciousness, was growing. we had already discovered how the new women impacted Indian women's history. The new women brought in the notion that education was very, very important for women. Now, people like Pandita Ramabai actually stressed this particular aspect of education. Pandita Ramabai said to get rid of the veil of oppression that the high caste Hindu women were facing, it was necessary for them to be educated. So you have, this continuation of this thread that for any change to occur, it is important for people, for women particularly, to be educated. This thread was also, continued by other women from Maharashtra, like Ramabai Ranade. Ramabai Ranade wrote in her book, Memoirs of Our Life Together, how her husband actually would encourage her to study. However, women within her own family would oppose that. They would make fun of her. They would actually go against the wishes of her husband and in certain ways make it almost extremely difficult for her to get the education that she desired and her husband desired. So women as tools of the patriarchy was something that was flagged by Pandita Ramabai, that was flagged by later Ramabai Ranade and many other women of this period. So, among the issues that were becoming very, very important were questions of widowhood, were questions of child marriage, were questions of lack of political rights. This, right now, people were talking about oppression through child marriage, oppression through widowhood, oppression through the social positioning of Hindu women, through the social positionings of Muslim women. Nobody clearly came about and talked about political rights. That would sort of come later. But around the same time, there were a number of organizations that were talking about how Hindu women could improve their lot, or women in India could improve their lot. And these organizations appeared in different parts of India. A leading organization that came, that appeared in Bengal was the Brahmo Samaj. Something very similar also again appeared in the city of Bombay, which is called Mumbai today. And this was the Prarthana Samaj. We have the, birth of a society called the Theosophical Society in Madras or today's Chennai. Then we have the Arya Samaj and the presence of the Arya Samaj in Punjab and in other parts of northern India. All of these organizations were actually flagging the issue that women needed a reform movement in India. Whether it is Bengal, whether it is Mumbai, whether it is Chennai, that is Bombay or Calcutta, such a reform movement was important. Such a reform movement was necessary. So we have the growth of two different consciousness. One is the feminist consciousness that was coming over and over again, that change needed to happen, and the other was a consciousness from the majoritarian society that society needed to be reformed. And why did the society need to be reformed? This also had to do with the British divide and rule policy. The British colonialism and the British government posed themselves as the champion of the oppressed in India. And women were considered as one of the leading communities of oppressed people. in India. And often the argument was that the government of Great Britain or the Queen had to be at the helm of affairs because without her, Indian women would be even more oppressed. So you have the consciousness of women who were asking for education, and you have the consciousness of the leaders of Indian society who were talking of reforms through education so that the society could reform itself and combat against this British onslaught that without the presence of the British, society will not be able to modernize itself or survive. From these generated slowly what we consider a political consciousness of the women in India. So we have the birth of a number of women's organizations. Like in 1910, we have the Bharata Stree Mahamandal. Then in 1970, we have the Women's India Association. In 1925, the birth of the National Council of Women in India. But perhaps the most important of these was in 1927, we have the birth of the All India Women's Conference. The All India Women's Conference was an organization that was elitist. There's no question about this. Most of these women's organizations were elitist. The women who led these organizations were actually the Begums, like the Begum of Bhopal, or people like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, or, the upper class women largely. That, and this group of women were often disregarded as a minuscule minority. It is true that they were a group of minority women, but what is not true is that their impact was not to be disregarded. They were women like Gyanodanandini Devi or Gyanodanandini Thakur from the Tagore family. She was an upper caste woman belonging to the Brahmo Samaj, belonging to this whole heritage of reformists who worked towards a change in women's lifestyles, or for that matter, Swarna Kumari Devi, again upper class woman, but their influence were really, really spread out. And that is why today, when we talk about these women, we have to say that they were feminist foremothers. We talked about, the feminist foremothers, as I said in the last lecture, but we have to understand that what was given to us from the feminist foremothers was continued by the next group of women who were generationally around the same time, but who were probably way more radical than the feminist foremothers, because frontally they claimed for political rights. And adding, to this were the reformist organizations, were the women's organizations, so much so that it created quite a stir in Indian society. Now, this was also the high point of the Indian National Congress movement. So a lot of what was happening was absorbed within the nationalist movement that was being led by organizations such as the Indian National Congress or the Muslim League, and there were presence of a number of very elite women in these organizations who were probably the first group of feminists who frontally asked for political rights. Now, there was another very interesting thing happening, and that was the imaginations of the nation as a woman, as mother. And artists such as Abanindranath Thakur were the people who gave a vision to these imaginings. They painted Mother India. And so now you have an icon of a woman who was being oppressed by the British. So this iconography, this nationalist imagination, social reformist, women asking for education, all sort of came down to women within the Indian National Congress. This is not to say that women were not in any other forums. Yes, women were in a number of forums, and I'm going to conclude with that, but we have to mention the Indian National Congress because this organization had the ability to give visibility to the feminist claims like no other organization. So among the women within the National Congress, I think the first woman that we have to mention is Annie Besant. Annie Besant was not a citizen to begin with, not a citizen of India. She was actually in England. She was from a left circle, a working class leader. She was one of the leaders of the matchstick workers' protest and a number of other such protests. But Annie Besant came to India, became part of the Theosophical Society in Madras, and made India her own. She was the first woman to be the president of the Indian National Congress. Annie Besant talked about the oppression of the Indian women. She talked about how education also needed to be there so that these women could get out of these oppressed state. Annie Besant was also one of the first women to talk about how women could organize themselves in political movement. So the issues that Annie Besant flagged were patriarchal family and culture, discrimination against women, education, etc. And while, we have the birth of new women and the schools that they were opening, you also have from, let's say, 1907 onwards, the presence of women like Annie Besant. Annie Besant was a woman who talked about how women should and can and ultimately did join the Home Rule movement. And she said this joining of a number of women into the Home Rule movement actually transformed the Home Rule movement. A lot has been written about Annie Besant's role. One of the people that who've written very well on this is Meera Desai about Annie Besant's role within the Indian National Congress and how she was one of the spokespersons for bringing in more women into the political movement. When one talks about feminists in the Indian National Congress, perforce, one has to talk about Sarojini Naidu. Again, Sarojini Naidu came from Bengal. She was a very upper-class woman, but she grew up in Hyderabad. She had a very cosmopolitan upbringing. She was fluent in Urdu. She was fluent in English. She wrote in English. And her consciousness as a woman leader and a feminist spokesperson came through two different mediums. In 1914, she came across Mahatma Gandhi, and she became a great sort of follower of Gandhi. In person, she used to call Gandhi a Mickey Mouse. And Gandhi knew about that. When he was once questioned that who called you a Mickey Mouse, he said, who can say such a thing but Sarojini Naidu? So she came a vantage point of class, but she was the first Indian woman to become the president of the Indian National Congress. Sarojini Naidu participated in multiple movements, Congress movements, such as she went to Jallianwala Bagh, she protested against the Rowlatt Act, she participated in the Rowlatt Satyagraha, she protested against the gunning down of people in Jallianwala Bagh, but more importantly for our sakes, she was the leader who made Congress accept the notion that it is important that women should get the right to vote. So, the enfranchisement of women came at the same time as we had the enfranchisement of the men in 1930s. Sarojini Naidu represented the Congress in a lot of forums all over the world. She traveled to England, she traveled to South Africa, being fluent in English and multiple other languages. She could meet these leaders as an equal, and she was the archetypal feminist consciousness and feminist leader, but her speeches were political. Her feminist consciousness came out more in her poetry and in her personal letters. So she was aware that she had to stay in these two different realms to be effective. Because the grand patriarch of Congress at that time was Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi supported the entry of women in politics, but he had this major debate with Margaret Sanger because he was of the opinion that sexuality was an issue that needed to be harnessed. Women needed to marry only to have progeny. He was against child marriage, but he was also against women deriving pleasure out of sex. So for Gandhi, women had a definite purpose. Women were good for picketing. Women were important to participate in nationalist movement because he thought or he said that they were morally stronger than the men, more ethical than the men. So they had a specific position. He never wanted women to fight out in the streets. He wanted women to picket against liquor shops, to participate in satyagraha. And so, there are certain roles in society that Gandhi sought to be, where women should lead. But there were other roles where he did not think women should come in and be a participant in. A very different kind of movement while the nationalist movement was going on was, when women participated in, let's say, the civil disobedience movement like Sarojini Naidu or the Quit India movement, there was another movement brewing up. Because mind you, the nationalist movement led by the Congress women was upper class. A more working class movement was happening in Tibhaga and Telangana, where peasant women were opposing their own patriarchies and the British colonialism. But that is a different story altogether. Suffice it to say for today that women grew within the National Congress and achieved a feminist presence in that. And they were very important for feminism to evolve and take a particular shape in India. Thank you very much.